I watched a lot of cool stuff for the first time this year, so I want to talk about my 20 favorites. I'm not going to be including any 2024 releases, that top 10 will get its own separate video. But on January 1st, I started the new year by watching Persona, the Bergman classic. Within the past year, I watched several more of his films, such as Life of the Marionettes and Hour of the Wolf, but have yet to find that euphoric feeling like I had at the end of Persona. I spent hours reading interpretations of what happened in this film, forming my own idea of what I thought actually took place, and that's one of my favorite things to do after watching a movie. I am still processing what I experienced because I was completely blown away by what I saw on the screen, and I hope that this is one I continue to revisit and have a completely different experience every single time. In a similar vein, both Mulholland Drive and Perfect Blue felt like good companion pieces to Persona, mostly because these are all dreamlike films featuring a female protagonist, and I truly don't believe there is a clear-cut explanation for any of these films, but I'm still wrapping my head around how unsettling the conclusion to Mulholland Drive was. I've spent much of this year filling in the gaps of all of David Lynch's projects, including all 3 seasons of Twin Peaks, but I do think this is my favorite. Perhaps it comes from me feeling like I have a better grasp on his style after watching many of his works, because there is often a specific framework and experience he wants his audience to go through. And so when I watched this film, I felt like I was able to fully surrender myself to its approach with its dreamlike storytelling and completely let go of any sort of conventional narrative I typically hope to see in other films. And then Perfect Blue is a film that I didn't know I needed, but I loved almost the second I started watching it. Like I mentioned, this is another film that has this dreamlike approach to its storytelling. However, I feel like the narrative is far more structured in a way that gives a much tighter conclusion, but the metaphor is still open-ended enough where I do think you can take away multiple interpretations. This film also greatly benefits from its animation, as it has a unique style that clearly gives a lot of inspiration for future films. But this year wasn't just one of dark, open-ended thrillers. I also checked off many auteur-driven films that were well overdue, such as Gladiator, Eyes Wide Shut, and Dog Day Afternoon. I obviously wanted to catch up on Gladiator before seeing the sequel, and it isn't a huge shock that I enjoyed this one much more than the second. Action is usually not my genre of choice, and it's pretty hit or miss, but this film goes far beyond surface-level violence. It's a heartwarming family story about resilience directed by one of the greats, and it isn't hard to see why this was such a box office juggernaut and an Oscar darling. Eyes Wide Shut was one of the few gaps I had from Stanley Kubrick, and it was just as mesmerizing as I thought it may be, with dynamic lighting compared to other films of his, such as Barry Lyndon, with a plot that I feel is only elevated over time, especially the more that Tom Cruise gets involved with cults. Dog Day Afternoon was a great example to me of how diverse Sidney Lumet can be with his directing style, and this film instantly became one of my favorites from his filmography, existing in what I consider to be the best picture lineup of all time, alongside Jaws, Nashville, Barry Lyndon, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a shame Pacino's Oscar did not come from this performance, because he is captivating in what I didn't realize would be such a sympathetic story. It might be blasphemous to compare Akiru and Garden State, but I can't lie and have to admit that they did give me similar feelings when it got to the end of these films. Akiru is a beautiful portrait of the life of a man that forced me to process death in a way I hadn't really done before. I almost feel inadequate to expand any more thoughts or feelings on the film, since it is one of those films that is often the top of the list for the greatest films of all time. All I can really say is that I was deeply moved, and it's hard to find a better film that celebrates life. And I'm not saying that Garden State is also one of the greatest films of all time. However, I think for the stage of life that I am coming out of, this film deeply resonated with me and gave me a similar sensation. I really did relate to this Zach Braff directed film. I found the soundtrack incredibly fun, and it just had the right amount of generic, cheesy, deep conversations that you often find yourself having late at night with friends. It's nothing too deeply profound, but just the right amount of feel-good and relatability. Mostly due to David Lynch, Harry Dean Stanton has become one of my most watched actors this year, but that's also thanks to watching Paris, Texas. Wim Wenders has such an unbiased perspective when filming characters. This film feels equally like a mystery trying to fill in the gaps of what happened with the protagonists, but also a deep reflection of humanity in some of the most beautiful shots I've seen all year. Cinema Paradiso is a love letter to all movies, and even if you are sick of that trope, I think you still will enjoy this one. While some might find it lengthy at times, I think it really had a lot of room to breathe and expand on these characters, all leading up to one of the most beautiful, satisfying endings I've ever seen. Now, one of the most fun experiences I had this year was watching Charade for the first time. Audrey Hepburn has always been one of my favorite actresses of all time, so it's always a good excuse to check out films of hers that I haven't yet seen. The chemistry and witty banter between her and Cary Grant is unmatched through this adventure comedy comedy that had me laughing out loud the majority of this runtime. And in a similar experience of witty manner and charming characters was Broadcast News. I originally watched this because I wanted to catch up on Albert Brooks and some of the films I haven't seen of his, but I was immediately charmed by Holly Hunter, and the dynamics of all the characters in this film are so charming. It was an excellent balance of a great love triangle meets introspective insight on television, which felt way ahead of its time with what it wanted to say about the media. As far as horror goes, it was kind of a mixed year for me, but as far as first-time watches goes, Possession did stand out far above the rest. I was motivated to watch it after hearing of the inspiration it played on the first Omen, and I was completely blown away with how dark and eerie this thing actually is. I watched several Spike Lee films this year, and the two that I enjoyed the most were Crooklyn and Bamboozled. Crooklyn was such a lovely experience, seeing the world through a child's eyes that left me absolutely devastated in the best way imaginable. Bamboozled was a much different experience, but I do think these films give a good insight of the range that Spike Lee can have. He is not subtle, and he enjoys being very on the nose, and Bamboozled is the best example of that, where you cannot deny what message he's trying to get across. The French Connection was a major omission on my William Friedkin checklist, and I wasn't surprised at all with how engaged I was with this thing. Friedkin has such a raw and gritty style that feels so real, with a rather simplistic plot, but it is executed so well that it absolutely stands the test of time within the action thriller genre. So hand up, I feel so silly not realizing that one of my favorite Brian De Palma films, Blowout, was inspired by the film Blow Up. Even with similar titles, I didn't realize that was pretty much a remake until I got to the second act of Blow Up. But nevertheless, this film was absolutely beautiful, and while I think Blowout does do some things I enjoy a bit more, it was really fun seeing where the inspiration came from. Likewise, The Conversation by Francis Ford Coppola is also so heavily inspired on Blow Up. Now, the fact that these plots are so similar, it didn't ruin it at all for me because I do think they handle things a little bit differently. Specifically with The Conversation, though, I just think there's something so special about watching this old tech and seeing how plot structures really have to revolve around things that just aren't the same anymore. But this was definitely the year of Coppola for me, mostly trying to rev up for Megalopolis. So while watching a lot of films of his I haven't yet seen, Rumblefish was one of my favorites. A great companion to The Outsiders, however, I think Rumblefish is far superior. It's a gritty coming of age where the moral may seem a little on the nose at times, but I still found it incredibly moving and kind of an odd feel-good flick. But ultimately, the Coppola kick led me to finally watch The Godfather for the first time, and yes, you heard that correctly. I also managed to reach my 2000th film logged on Letterboxd this year, so it felt like as good a time as ever to finally check this off the list. And honestly, there isn't really anything I can say about this that hasn't already been said. This is one of the most profile films of all time. It's a masterpiece. It's grand. It's majestic, and I don't think I'll be able to fully process my thoughts until I see it a dozen more times. So those are some of the films I watched for the first time in 2024. I would love to hear what you watched for the first time that you absolutely fell in love with. So please comment below, be on the lookout for my favorite films of 2024 coming soon, and I will see you next time.